The knock came after midnight, when the wind off the Sacramento mountains had teeth. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a bird hitting a window pane, a sound so small the blizzard almost swallowed it whole. But Ben heard it. He'd spent years living alone in this cabin, and his ears knew the difference between the sounds of the wild and the sounds of men. This was the sound of a person at the very end of their rope. He set down the snare line he was mending, his hand going instinctively to the cold steel of the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall. No one came up this high in a storm. No one sane, anyway. Another knock, weaker this time. A desperate scratching. He unbarred the heavy wooden door and pulled it open just a crack. A woman stood there, or what was left of one. She was more snow than person, her clothes torn to ribbons, her hair a tangled mess of golden ice. Her face was raw from the wind, her lips cracked and bleeding. But it was her eyes that stopped him, wide and exhausted, but with a flicker of fight still left in them, a fire buried deep in the embers. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Just some scraps, a place to rest under the porch. I won't be any trouble." His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 30 years, was to slam the door. Strangers meant trouble, always, especially for a man with Apache blood, a man the world had tried to break more times than he could count. But then he looked at her again, at the bruises on her wrists, faint but undeniable, at the way she held herself, not begging, but demanding to stay upright on her own 2 feet. This wasn't a grifter. This was a survivor. He stepped back without a word, opening the door wider. She practically fell inside, swaying as the warmth of the hearth hit her. He slid the bar back into place, the heavy thud echoing in the sudden silence. "Sit," he grunted, pointing to a bench by the fire. He ladled some venison stew into a bowl and set it in front of her. She ate like a wolf, her hands shaking so badly the spoon rattled against her teeth. When she was done, she slumped back, eyes closed, breathing like she'd just outrun a devil. He saw the filth caked under her nails, smelled the sour scent of fear that clung to her like a shroud. This was a woman who had been caged. "There's a washroom out back," he said, his voice flat. "Pump's cold, but there's soap." She looked at him, surprised that he'd offer such a thing. She just nodded, her eyes showing a flicker of gratitude before the exhaustion took over again. She was gone for a long time. When she came back, the grime was gone. Her wet hair was combed back from her face, and in the flickering firelight, he saw her. Really saw her, and his heart stopped. It was her, the woman from his dreams. For months, he'd had the same vision, a woman with pale eyes standing by the stream that ran past his cabin, calling his name. He'd always dismissed it as loneliness, a trick of a mind left too long in solitude. But here she was, flesh and blood, breathing the air in his cabin. He stared, unable to look away, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. She saw him looking, a small frown creasing her brow. "What is it?" He shook his head, forcing his gaze away. "Nothing." She pulled the blanket he'd given her tighter around her shoulders. "My name is Kate," she said, her voice stronger now. "I was taken, lured by a promise of good work. It was a lie." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. "They kept me locked up. A month, maybe more. I don't know. I finally got away yesterday. I just ran. I didn't think I'd make it." She looked at him then, her gaze direct. "I have to get home. My mother, she was sick when I left. She'll be worried." Ben listened, his jaw tight. He knew the kind of men she was talking about, men who preyed on the weak, who saw people as property. He'd seen it his whole life. "You'll stay the night," he said. "Leave at first light." She nodded, curling up on the bench, and was asleep in moments. The cabin grew quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. But Ben couldn't sleep. He lay on his cot, the image of her face burned into his mind. He closed his eyes and the dream came again, clearer than ever before. He was by the stream, the moonlight turning the water to silver. His mother stood on the opposite bank, just as he remembered her from his boyhood. She pointed a slender hand toward the cabin. "She is the one," his mother said in the old tongue. "The woman from the visions. You cannot let her walk this path alone." "Why her?" Ben asked, his voice tight. His mother smiled a sad, knowing smile. Because she carries a great sorrow, and you carry a great strength. Together you may find what you have both lost. The dream faded, but the words remained, echoing in the darkness. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, Kate was already awake, tying her ragged shoes. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and formal. "I won't trouble you any longer." Ben just nodded, but as she reached for the door, he slung his Winchester over his shoulder. "I have business in town," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll walk with you." She looked at him, surprise and gratitude warring in her eyes. "You don't have to." "It's no burden," he replied, though he knew it was a lie. This was no simple trip to town. This was the start of the path his mother had shown him, a path that led straight into the heart of the darkness Kate had just escaped. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would walk it with her, no matter where it led. The trail down from the mountains was a frozen scar on the land. They walked in silence, Ben a few paces behind Kate, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig made his hand twitch toward his rifle. He wasn't walking her to town. He was guarding her. He was fulfilling the command from his dream, and the weight of it settled on his shoulders like a winter cloak. Kate seemed to feel it too. She turned once, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "You're not really going to town for business, are you?" He didn't answer. He just kept watching the ridges. She gave a small, tired smile. "You don't have to lie, but thank you." They walked on. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the shared knowledge of the cruelty they had both witnessed. He saw the way she flinched when a deer bolted from the underbrush, the way her eyes darted toward any unexpected sound. The cage was gone, but the fear remained. By midday they reached a rise that overlooked the valley where she'd grown up. Below, a small clapboard house stood silent and still. There was no smoke curling from the chimney. The garden was a wreck of snow-covered, brittle stalks. A shutter hung from a single hinge, banging a lonely rhythm in the wind. A terrible stillness hung over the place. Kate saw it, and her pace quickened. A desperate hope warred with a rising dread in her eyes. "Almost there," she whispered, the words meant for herself. She practically ran the last 100 yards, stumbling on the frozen ground, her ragged breathing tearing at the quiet air. She threw open the door to the little house. "Mama?" The word was a choked cry. The air inside was colder than the air outside. It was stale, thick with the smell of dust and cold ashes. The house was empty, not just of people, but of life. A half-finished shawl lay draped over a rocking chair, the knitting needles still stuck in the yarn, as if her mother had just stepped out for a moment. But she hadn't. Kate sank to her knees, a raw, wounded sound tearing from her throat. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ben stood in the doorway, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He knew this kind of grief, the kind that hollows you out from the inside. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind him. An older woman from the next farm over was approaching, her face a mask of pity. "Child," she said softly, kneeling beside Kate, "we prayed you were alive." Kate looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "My mother? Where is she?" The neighbor wrung her hands, her gaze falling to the floorboards. "She passed, dear, about a week after you went missing." The worry, it was too much for her heart. She hesitated, then added something that made the blood in Ben's veins run cold. "A couple of men came by asking for you. Rough-looking men, in a fancy wagon. She told them to leave. After they left, she just seemed to give up." Kate let out a strangled cry, grabbing the shawl from the rocker and clutching it to her chest, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of her mother. It wasn't just worry that had killed her. It was them. The men who had taken her daughter had come back, and their visit had been the final blow. Ben stepped inside, his face grim. He knelt beside Kate, his voice low and steady. "Breathe," he said, "like the river, slow." She looked at him, her eyes blazing with a grief so profound it was terrifying. "They killed her," she whispered, the words like shards of glass. "They took me, and they came back, and they killed her." He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply said, yes. The weight of that single word hung in the air, an acknowledgement of the terrible truth. He had seen this before. The casual cruelty of powerful men, leaving a trail of broken lives in their wake. But this time was different. This time, he was a part of it. The dream had not just shown him a woman in need. It had shown him a war. And he was standing on the front line. That night, Kate refused to leave the house. She curled up on her mother's bed, a ghost in a haunted room. Ben sat by the cold hearth, keeping watch, his rifle across his lap. He didn't build a fire. The cold seemed appropriate. It matched the ice that was forming in his own heart. Hours passed. He heard her quiet sobs finally fade into an exhausted, restless sleep. He stepped outside, the stars like chips of ice in the black sky. He looked up at them and spoke to his mother's spirit in his own tongue. You sent me to her, but you didn't tell me I was walking into a grave. The wind whispered through the pines, offering no answer. At dawn, Kate emerged from the bedroom. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale, but the grief had been burned away. In its place was something else, something hard and sharp. She sat at the table, her hands clenched into fists. I'm done crying, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. They took me. They tormented my mother. They think because we're poor, because we're women, that we don't matter, that they can just erase us. She looked directly at Ben, her gaze so intense it was like looking into a furnace. I'm not going to let them erase anyone else. I am going to burn their whole rotten world to the ground. Ben studied her, seeing the girl who had collapsed at his door transformed into a warrior. The sorrow had been forged into a weapon. His mother's words came back to him. She carries a great sorrow, and you carry a great strength. He finally understood. Her sorrow was her strength. He stood up, the decision made. This path will be dangerous, he said. They will try to kill you. Let them try, she answered, her voice ringing with a terrible certainty. He gave a slow nod. Then you will not walk it alone. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a wave of relief so powerful it was almost visible. For the first time, she looked at him not as a savior, but as an ally, a partner. The choice had been made. His life of solitude was over. He was no longer just a man hiding from the world. He was a weapon, and he had just been aimed. Their first move was to return to the source of the poison. Kate, her memory sharpened by rage, led him to the abandoned office in town where she'd first been interviewed. It was just a shell, its windows broken, snow drifting in through the collapsed roof. But in the rusted-out stove, half buried in ashes, she found it, a ledger. Most of it was burned, but several pages remained, filled with a list of names. Women's names. Next to each name was a set of initials and a destination. A few names were crossed out. These are the others, Kate whispered, her hand trembling as she traced a name. Sarah B. sent to the mining camps. Proof, Ben said, his voice a low growl. But not enough. The man who runs this town, Caraway, he owns the law. This book is just paper to them. That night back at her mother's house, they studied the charred pages by the light of a single lamp. The list of names was sickeningly long. Each one represented a life stolen, a family shattered. As they sat there in the oppressive silence, a floorboard creaked on the porch outside. Instantly, Ben was on his feet, rifle in his hand. He moved to the door without a sound, a phantom in the dark. He eased it open and slipped outside. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the trees and bolted. Ben didn't shoot to kill. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the rifle echoing across the silent valley. The figure vanished into the darkness. Ben came back inside, his face a grim mask. They know you're here, he said. They were watching us. Kate's blood ran cold. They'll come for me. Yes, Ben said, his eyes hard as stone. Which means we go for them first. The next day they walked into town. It felt like walking into a nest of snakes. Ben carried a deer carcass to the trading post as a pretense, while Kate moved through the streets listening. The whispers were everywhere. Caraway was preparing another big wagon run, heading south. More girls had gone missing in the last few weeks, vanishing from nearby farms. It was happening again, right under their noses. She saw him then, Caraway himself stepping out of the saloon. He was dressed in a fine black coat and a silk vest, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He smiled at the people who greeted him, a picture of respectability. But Kate saw the predator beneath the polished exterior. She saw the cold, dead eyes of a man who dealt in human misery. Their eyes met across the muddy street. For a split second, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a look of pure, venomous hatred. He knew who she was, the one that got away. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to a burly man standing by the saloon doors, a man wearing a deputy's badge. Ben saw it too. He materialized at Kate's side, his hand resting on her arm, a silent warning. "We leave now," he murmured. They walked away, the feeling of Caraway's eyes burning into their backs. "He owns the law," Kate said, her voice tight with fury. "Then we need a higher law," Ben replied. That evening they went to the small church at the edge of town. The pastor, Reverend Whiteham, was a thin, weary man whose eyes held the sadness of 1,000 unheard prayers. He remembered Kate's mother, speaking of her with a gentle kindness that made Kate's throat ache. She told him everything, about her capture, about Caraway, about the ledger. As she spoke, the pastor's face grew pale. "I have heard whispers," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Terrible whispers. But Caraway's money flows through this town like a river. To stand against him is to stand against the town itself." "So you'll do nothing?" Kate demanded, her voice rising. "You'll let him keep stealing daughters while you pray for their souls?" "What can I do?" he cried, his hands fluttering helplessly. "I am one man." Kate slammed the burned ledger down on the table between them. "Here are the names of the lost. This isn't a whisper, it's a scream. Will you listen?" Whittem stared at the book, his face ashen. He slowly opened it, his finger tracing the list of names. He stopped at one. "Mary," he breathed, his voice breaking. "My own sister. She vanished 20 years ago. They said she ran off with a traveler." He looked up at Kate, a new terrible light in his eyes. The doubt was gone, replaced by a righteous fury that mirrored her own. "This is not just kindling," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength. "It is a testament, and with God as my witness, this town will hear it." Just then, the church door creaked open. The deputy stood there, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His eyes flicked from the pastor to Kate, and then to the ledger on the table. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Reverend," he said, his voice dripping with false respect. "Mr. Caraway would like a word with the girl. He's very concerned for her well-being." The trap had been sprung. They hadn't just been watched, they had been followed, and now they were cornered. Ben moved so fast he was a blur. Before the deputy could even draw his weapon, Ben had crossed the room and slammed the man's head against the doorframe. The deputy crumpled to the floor unconscious. "We have to go," Ben said, grabbing the ledger. "Now!" "Where?" the Reverend gasped, his face white with shock. "Out the back. Through the graveyard," Ben commanded. "He won't be the only one coming." They slipped out into the cold night, the sounds of shouting already echoing from the front of the church. Men were swarming the building, Caraway's men. They ran through the graveyard, stumbling over ancient headstones, the icy wind tearing at them. Behind them, lanterns bobbed in the darkness as the hunt began. They reached the edge of the woods, pausing for a moment to catch their breath. Looking back, they could see the church surrounded. "He wanted me alive," Kate panted. "Why?" "To make an example of you," Ben said grimly. "To show everyone what happens when his property tries to run." The words hit her like a physical blow. Property. That's all she was to him. A thing to be bought and sold. The rage that had been simmering inside her erupted into a wildfire. They followed a wagon trail south, keeping to the shadows. They knew Caraway's men would be scouring the main roads. Their only chance was to see his operation firsthand, to find the heart of his network. At dawn, they saw it. A wagon, one of Caraway's, pulled off the main road and onto a hidden track. It stopped to pick up two young women, their faces pale with fear, led by a man in a bowler hat. "It's happening again," Kate whispered, her fists clenched so tight her nails dug into her palms. Ben put a hand on her shoulder. "We follow. We see where they go. Then we cut out the route." They shadowed the wagon for miles, deep into the rocky canyons outside of town. As dusk fell, they saw smoke rising from a narrow ravine. Tucked against the cliff face was a compound, a collection of rough-hewn buildings surrounded by a high fence, a false freight depot. Men with rifles lounged on the porches, their faces hard and cruel. "That's it," Kate breathed, her whole body trembling. "That's the place they kept me." Ben studied the compound, his eyes narrowed, calculating. He counted the guards, noted the layout, searched for a weakness. "There are too many," he said finally. "We can't take this place alone." "Then we won't be alone," Kate said, her voice filled with a grim determination. They slipped back toward town under the cover of darkness, a desperate plan forming in their minds. They went straight to the blacksmith's forge. The blacksmith was a mountain of a man named Silas, whose niece had vanished the previous autumn. They found him hammering a piece of glowing steel, sparks flying in the darkness. Reverend Whitam, his face set like granite, explained what they had found. He showed Silas the ledger. Kate pointed to a name on the list. "Eliza," she said softly. The hammer fell from Silas's hand, clattering on the stone floor. He looked at the book, then at Kate, his eyes burning with a grief and fury that matched their own. "Where is this place?" he growled. Within the hour, a small group had gathered in the cellar of the church. Silas the blacksmith, two ranchers whose daughters had been lured away by false promises of work in the city, and a quiet, grieving mother who clutched a small, faded portrait of her missing child. Kate stood before them, the ledger in her hands. She told them her story. She described the depot in the canyon, the faces of the guards, the terror in the eyes of the new girls she had seen taken. Her voice didn't waver. It was cold, clear, and filled with the terrible power of truth. "They took me," she said, her gaze moving from one face to another. "They took your daughters, your niece, and they will keep taking more until someone makes them stop. I am asking you to be that someone. Help me." For a long moment, the only sound was the weeping of the grieving mother. Then Silas slammed his massive fist on the table, making the lanterns jump. "I'll see Caraway in hell for what he did to Eliza," he snarled. One by one, the others nodded, their faces grim, their eyes hard. It wasn't an army. It was a handful of broken-hearted, furious people. But they had something Caraway's hired guns didn't. They had a reason to fight. "We ride at dawn," Ben said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final command. As they rode out of town the next morning, a small, grim procession, Kate felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. But as she looked at the faces around her, the pastor, the blacksmith, the ranchers, all of them scarred by the same evil, she knew she wasn't alone anymore. She glanced at Ben, riding silently beside her. His face was unreadable, but she saw the fire in his eyes. They were riding into the heart of the beast. They might not all ride out, but they would make it bleed. The air in the canyon was so cold it felt like breathing powdered glass. Their small posse moved like ghosts along a high ridge overlooking Caraway's depot. Below, the compound was waking up. Guards shuffled about, sipping coffee, their rifles leaning carelessly against the walls. Two large wagons stood ready, their canvas covers hiding the human cargo within. Kate's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and fury. In that barn down there, girls were huddled in the dark, their hope draining away with every passing minute. Ben raised a hand and they all dismounted, creeping forward on foot. 12 guards I can see," he whispered. "More inside. We go for the barn first, free the girls, create chaos, then we fight." The plan was simple, desperate, probably suicidal. They slid down the scree slope, using the rocks for cover. Ben moved with a predator's grace, silent and lethal. He took out the first guard by the corral with the hilt of his knife, a single, brutal blow. They dragged the body into the brush and moved on. At the barn, Silas and the ranchers used a crowbar to pry the heavy lock from the door. The screech of metal was terrifyingly loud in the morning quiet. The door swung open on a scene of pure misery. A dozen girls were crammed into stalls, their wrists bound, their eyes wide with terror. One of them saw Kate and gasped. You came back for us." "We all get out today," Kate said, her voice shaking as she and the grieving mother began cutting the ropes. They herded the freed captives out of the barn and up the slope to a small cave they had scouted earlier. Just as the last girl scrambled to safety, a shout echoed from the compound. They'd been spotted. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the depot. Bullets whined past their heads, chipping stone from the rocks they used as cover. The blacksmith Silas roared in anger and charged down the hill, his rifle swinging like a club. He smashed one guard from his horse before a bullet tore through his shoulder, sending him sprawling. The ranchers laid down covering fire, their shots precise and deadly. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. And then they heard it. The thunder of hoofbeats. A column of riders was approaching from the south, with Caraway himself at their head. He reined in his horse, a cruel smile playing on his lips as he took in the scene. "Well, well," he called out, his voice smooth and mocking. "The little bird who flew the coop, and she brought all her broken-wing friends back with her. Did you really think you could win?" Kate stepped out from behind the rocks, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She held up the burned ledger. "It's over, Caraway. I have the names. Everyone will know what you are." He laughed, a chilling, empty sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "That little book. That's kindling. The law in this territory eats from my hand. Your word against mine? No one will believe you." He raised a gloved hand, and his men leveled their rifles. Ben moved, placing himself squarely in front of Kate, a human shield. "Get back," he ordered. "No," she said, her voice ringing with defiance. "I'm done hiding." The first shot came. One of the ranchers cried out and fell. Chaos erupted again. Ben was a whirlwind of deadly motion, firing, reloading, moving. Two of Caraway's men went down, but more were closing in. It was hopeless. They were going to be slaughtered. Then Kate did something extraordinary. She climbed onto the highest boulder, making herself a clear target. She held the ledger high above her head. "People of this valley!" she screamed, her voice carrying an impossible distance. "Your daughters are in this book. Caraway took them. The proof is here." Unbeknownst to them, the sounds of the gunfight had drawn people from the nearby farms and the town itself. They were gathered on the far ridge, a silent, watching crowd. Gasps and cries rippled through them as they heard Kate's words. A woman screamed, "My Sarah!" Another man shouted, "Eliza!" Caraway's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "Shut her up!" he roared at his men. Two riders broke from the main group, charging straight for Kate. Ben intercepted them. He moved with a speed that was barely human, unhorsing one rider with the butt of his rifle and sinking his knife into the other. He was a demon of vengeance, protecting his charge. Caraway, seeing his authority crumbling, drew his own silver-plated pistol. He aimed it directly at Kate's heart. "Pretty speeches won't save you," he snarled. The world seemed to slow down. Kate saw the dark hole of the barrel, the cold hatred in his eyes. She braced for the impact. A single shot cracked through the canyon. But it wasn't from Caraway's gun. His pistol flew from his hand, sent spinning into the dirt by a bullet fired from Ben's Winchester. A perfect, impossible shot. A roar went up from the ridge. The crowd of onlookers, their fear finally overcome by their rage, surged down the hillside. They were armed with farm tools, hunting rifles, and decades of pent-up fury. They swarmed the compound, overwhelming Caraway's men. Caraway, his face ashen with terror, tried to flee, but he was pulled from his horse. The townsfolk descended on him, their hands tearing at his fine clothes, their voices a chorus of rage and grief. His empire of cruelty, built on secrets and fear, had been torn down in a matter of minutes by one woman's courage and one man's aim. When the dust settled, the yard was a scene of carnage and catharsis. Caraway's men were rounded up, their weapons taken. The freed girls were crying, hugging the strangers who had come to their rescue. Kate slid down from the boulder, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She looked at Ben. He had a bloody gash on his shoulder. His face was grimed with gunpowder, but he was alive. Relief, so powerful it felt like a physical blow, washed over her. "You saved me," she whispered. He looked from her to the crowd of liberated women and vengeful townsfolk. He shook his head. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved everyone." And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of their battle, they weren't just allies anymore. They were two halves of the same warrior soul, forged together in the fires of justice. That night, the church was filled to overflowing. By the light of 100 lanterns, Reverend Whitman stood at the pulpit and read every single name from the burned ledger. Each name was a stone dropped into the silent pool of the town's conscience. Men wept openly. Women held each other, sharing a grief that had, until now, been borne in silence. Caraway and his men sat shackled in the front pew, their heads bowed, stripped of their power. The town had passed its own judgment. Kate sat near the back, the warmth of a small fire on her face. She was exhausted, bone-deep weary, but for the first time in months, a fragile sense of peace settled over her. Ben stood behind her, a silent guardian. He hadn't said much since the battle, but his presence was a comfort, a solid wall she could lean against. When the meeting was over, she reached back and touched his hand. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling small and inadequate. He looked down at her, and in the dim light, she saw something in his dark eyes she had never seen before, a profound tenderness. "My mother's dream spoke the truth," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear. He didn't explain, and she didn't ask. It was enough to know that some force beyond her understanding had brought this fierce, quiet man to her door on that terrible night. The next morning, the valley was quiet. The townsfolk, their rage spent, began the slow process of healing. The freed women were taken in, cared for, their stories finally heard. Kate and Ben returned to her mother's small house. It no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a sanctuary. Kate placed the ledger on the mantelpiece, a permanent reminder of the price of silence. She sank into the rocking chair, staring at the unfinished shawl. "It's over," she whispered, "but I feel so empty." Ben knelt in front of her. He took her hands in his. They were rough, calloused, but gentle. "Empty is just a space to be filled," he said. "You've cleared the ground. Now you get to choose what grows there." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the loneliness that had lived in his eyes for so long. "And you, Ben?" she asked softly. "Will you go back to your mountain?" He was silent for a long time. She could see the struggle in his face, the pull of the solitude that had been his only companion. "My mountain will wait," he said at last. I think I've found a new place to stand." A small, watery smile touched her lips. It was the first true smile she'd had since the day she was taken. It felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. Spring came, and with it, life returned to the valley. The snow melted, the creeks ran full and clear, and green shoots pushed their way through the dark earth. The town was changing. A council was formed to watch the roads, to question strangers, to make sure that the evil Caraway had brought could never take root again. Kate's house became a haven. The girls who had nowhere else to go stayed with her. The little cabin, once filled with grief, was now filled with the sounds of timid laughter, of women learning to trust again. Kate taught them to read and write, to plant a garden, to reclaim the lives that had been stolen from them. Ben was always there. He repaired the leaky roof, built more beds, and taught the women how to track and hunt. He rarely spoke, but his steady, quiet presence was the foundation on which they all rebuilt their lives. The townsfolk, who had once looked at him with suspicion, now greeted him with nods of respect. They had seen him fight. They knew his worth. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Ben sat on the porch, carving a small piece of wood. Kate came and sat beside him. He was carving a bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. "It's beautiful," she said. He didn't look up from his work. "Just keeping my hands busy." She reached out and gently touched the half-finished bird, her fingers brushing against his. "Ben," she whispered, "you don't have to be silent anymore. Not with me." He finally looked at her. The air between them crackled with a current of unspoken emotion, a connection forged in terror and tempered in battle. Slowly, she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. A quiet, certain joining of two souls who had been lost and had found their way home in each other. He didn't pull away. Instead, his hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle. When they parted, her eyes were shining. "Stay," she whispered. And for the first time, a real smile touched Ben's lips. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. By summer, the garden was flourishing. Laughter, real and joyful, echoed through the yard. In the fall, the town held a festival, a celebration of their newfound freedom and resilience. As Kate and Ben walked through the lantern-lit square hand in hand, a little girl, one of the first they had rescued, ran up to them. "Miss Kate," she asked shyly, "are you and Mr. Ben married?" Kate blushed, but before she could answer, Ben leaned down, his eyes twinkling. "Not yet," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but someday." Later that night, they stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. The lights of the town twinkled below, a constellation of hope. Kate leaned her head on his shoulder. "Your mother's dream," she said. "You never told me what it was." He put his arm around her, holding her close. "She told me you carried a great sorrow, and I carried a great strength," he said. "She told me that together we could find peace." He paused, then added, "She was right." They stood there for a long time, the cool night wind whispering through the pines, the town breathing peacefully below. The long night was over. A new day had dawned, not just for the valley, but for the two souls on the ridge who had walked through the darkest of fires and emerged into the light together. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of courage and justice, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and, more importantly, subscribe to the channel. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. Thanks for listening.